Beer is older than writing, older than the wheel, older than most things we consider the foundations of civilization. And the story of how it was invented is not the story of a brewer in a workshop. It is the story of an accident, one that changed the entire trajectory of human history in ways that most people have never considered. Start with grain. Around 10,000 years ago, humans in the Fertile Crescent began doing something that had never been done before. They stopped following food. They started growing it. Wild grains like barley and emmer wheat were collected, planted, harvested, and stored. This was the agricultural revolution. And it created a problem nobody anticipated. Stored grain gets wet, rain gets in, flooding happens, moisture finds its way into storage vessels in ways that ancient humans had no reliable way to prevent. Wet grain sits. It warms. And when it warms, something begins to happen inside it. The grain starts to sprout, enzymes activate, starches begin converting into sugars. And then, if wild yeast finds it, which it almost always does because wild yeast is everywhere, those sugars begin fermenting. Nobody planned this. Nobody understood the chemistry, but someone at some point tasted the result and did not throw it away. What they tasted was something between porridge and liquid. Slightly sweet, slightly sour, mildly alcoholic, strange, but not unpleasant, and it made them feel different, not just different, better, warmer, looser, less anxious, more connected to the people around them. The specific neurochemistry of why alcohol does this to the human brain would not be understood for thousands of years, but the effect was immediately, obviously real, and it was repeatable, which meant it was worth understanding. The earliest direct evidence of beer comes from a site in Iran called Godin Tepe. Ceramic vessels dating to around 3,500 BCE were found with residue on their inner walls. Chemical analysis identified calcium oxalate, a compound produced specifically during the fermentation of grain. The vessels were beer jugs. But there is older evidence still. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, massive stone structures built around 10,000 BCE contain enormous carved stone vessels. Some researchers believe these were used for large-scale fermentation, which would mean that communal beer drinking predates agriculture itself, not by a little, by potentially thousands of years. This is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because if beer came before farming, it raises a question that archaeologists have been arguing about for decades. Did humans settle down to grow food, or did they settle down to brew it? The standard history says humans discovered agriculture, settled into communities, and then developed fermentation as a byproduct of grain storage. But some researchers now argue the sequence may have been different. That humans first discovered fermentation from wild grains, that the desire to reliably produce that fermented drink motivated the systematic cultivation of grain. That farming, in other words, may have followed beer rather than preceded it. This is not a fringe theory. It has been seriously proposed by researchers at major institutions. And while the debate is not settled, the evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe suggests that large-scale communal consumption of fermented beverages was happening very early, before cities, before writing, before most of what we call civilization. Here is what makes beer historically significant beyond the drink itself. Making beer in meaningful quantities requires cooperation. You need people to grow the grain, people to harvest it, people to manage the fermentation, people to distribute the result. Beer was not a solo activity, it was a communal one. And communal activities, especially ones centered around a shared experience that makes people feel good, create social bonds. Researchers who study the anthropology of alcohol have found something consistent across cultures. Shared drinking is one of the most universal bonding mechanisms humans have ever developed. It creates trust. It lowers social barriers. It makes strangers feel like allies, and allies feel like family. In a world where cooperation was survival, anything that reliably built social bonds was not just pleasant, it was strategically valuable. There is also a practical dimension that often gets overlooked. Ancient water was not safe. Rivers and standing water in early settlements were frequently contaminated with animal waste, with human waste, with the runoff of communities that had not yet developed sanitation. Drinking untreated water in an early human settlement was a genuine health risk. Beer was not. The fermentation process and the mild acidity it produces kills many of the pathogens that made ancient water dangerous. This was not understood at a scientific level by the people drinking it, but the outcome was observable. People who drank beer got sick less often than people who drank untreated water. Beer was not just a social lubricant. In many historical contexts, it was the safer option. It was, in the most literal sense, medicine. The Sumerians, who left some of the earliest written records in human history, wrote about beer constantly. The world's oldest known recipe is a beer recipe, carved into a clay tablet around 1800 BCE. They had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi. There is a hymn to her that doubles as a brewing instruction manual, step by step, grain to liquid, written down with the same care and specificity that modern cultures use to record laws and histories, because beer was that important. Sumerian workers were paid partially in beer. Daily rations included a beer allocation that varied by social rank, laborers who built the ziggurats, scribes who kept the records, officials who administered the cities. All of them received beer as part of their compensation. It was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. By the time ancient Egypt rose to power, beer was fully embedded in every layer of society. Workers who built the pyramids received daily beer rations, 4 to 5 liters per day per worker, not as a reward, as fuel. Beer provided calories, it provided hydration, it provided a mild analgesic effect that helped workers endure physically brutal conditions. The pyramids were not built on mysticism and forced labor alone. They were built, in part, on beer. There is something almost humbling about tracing this back to its beginning. A wet grain storage vessel, somewhere in the ancient Near East, wild yeast finding its way in. A human tasting the result by accident, deciding not to throw it away. That moment, accidental and unrecorded, set in motion a chain of events that shaped agriculture, social bonding, urban development, labor economics, religious practice, and the daily lives of billions of people across thousands of years. Not because anyone planned it, because someone was curious enough to taste something strange, and smart enough to recognize that strange was not the same as bad. Basically, humans did not invent beer. They stumbled into it, and then spent the next 10,000 years figuring out how to make it better.